You want to go ahead and take some calls?
Yeah, let's go to calls.
All right, we've got Kyle. Whoops. Kyle in Georgetown, you're here.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. How you doing?
Pretty good. I'm a big, long-time fan of the show. But I called in a few weeks ago, and I wasn't able to really kind of say what I wanted to say. I'm not used to talking on, with people on television with lots of people listening, and
nobody's listening.
And I'm also kind of scared, like that I'm gonna say the wrong thing, get hung up on, and everything. But I think I can say what I wanted to say kind of quickly.
Okay.
Well, in the discussion we had, we came down to talking about the issue of certainty, and do you believe this or that, and do you believe in God, etc. And I used the example of a court case, and I think what you said was, well, if you don't vote to convict because there's a reasonable doubt, then that means that you don't believe it, were your words. And I think that two things I'd like to say about that. One is that it's definitely false, that you're dead wrong on that one.
Well, I don't even know what it is that you're saying that I said, so I can't really say whether I was dead wrong or not.
You said that if you don't vote to convict somebody because there is a reasonable doubt, then that means that you did not believe that they were guilty. That's what you said.
Yeah, you weren't sufficiently convinced of their guilt to say they were guilty. Yes, that's true. It's a tautology.
So I definitely believe that that's wrong.
Well, how's it wrong?
How's it wrong is I think that, at the most level that a lot of people have seen, a lot of times you'll get jurors and they'll come out and they say, no, we thought he was guilty, but for such and such reason, because there's a reasonable doubt, doesn't mean that you don't, think that it's the case. And you may have indirect evidence about something or an overwhelming
we're talking about a conclusion. If you are actually convinced of the defendant's guilt, and we're going to set aside legal technicalities for this, This is just an analogy, but if you are actually convinced of the defendant's guilt, then you vote guilty. And if you're not convinced of the defendant's guilt, then you vote not guilty.
Well, I think that the standard is a reasonable doubt, legally. Is there a reasonable doubt?
Yes.
And I think that, well, yeah, and I think
first of all, there are different standards for different claims. There's reasonable doubt, there's preponderance of the evidence, et cetera, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
The thing is, if you believe that the defendant is guilty, under whatever standard of evidence you're talking about, then you vote guilty.
No. For instance, I can give you an example. Okay. For instance, if you have an overwhelming feeling when you meet a person that that you find them to be a scary person, possibly violent, say say you have a child and this is going to be somebody who your child's going to be around or something, and as soon as you meet them, you think this person is scary. Now you can't on that you can't say that you're certain that they've done anything.
Who mentioned anything about certainty? Certainty is completely irrelevant.
Okay, absolutely. All right, well then let's go back to reasonable doubt.
I don't care how you define the standard. But basically, what you're starting with is, hey, I've got a feeling about somebody. Well, how's that relevant?
That's what I started with.
How's that relevant to the point that I was making?
It's relevant because of human decision making and how it works. And we're talking about.
No. You could have irrational people on the jury. I'm talking about what they are actually convinced of. If you are in fact convinced that the defendant did it, then you are convinced they are guilty.
Based on the evidence, not based on your feeling.
But there still may be a reasonable doubt. Well, let me give you one more thing.
If the standard is you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, then there's no longer a reasonable doubt.
Well, I think that if you were to take a list of questions and ask people, do you believe this? Do you believe it? Do you believe this is true? Do you feel confident that this is true? And then you were to, ask 100 questions and then go down that list and then ask people, is there a reasonable doubt about this one? Is there a reasonable doubt about this one? You're not going to line up perfectly.
You are focused on exactly the wrong thing, because now you've moved on to people's professions of what they believe versus what they actually believe. The courtroom analogy is an analogy. We can sit here and come up with all sorts of exceptions that are completely irrelevant. I don't know what your point is that you're getting at. Because my position is that if you either believe or you do not believe. And you can be belief is the result of becoming convinced, and you can be convinced based on good reasons or bad reasons. But when you believe something, that means that you are convinced that this is likely true.
But it doesn't mean that you have no doubts.
Nobody said no doubts. As a matter of fact, I tossed out absolute certainty pretty much every time we've talked about this.
I think it doesn't mean that you don't have a reasonable doubt.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, Kyle, how you go about defining reasonable doubt.
Okay.
That's completely irrelevant.
Okay, well, let me just say about that. Like I said, I had two things I wanted to say about it.
Okay.
But my final statement about the reasonable doubt issue is, I think that most of the audience would probably agree that a lot of times when people don't convict, that they do believe that the person was guilty, but that they've been instructed by the court that if there's a reasonable doubt, they
Holy
can convict.
crap, Kyle! I just said let's set aside the legal exceptions and stuff. It's an analogy. It's not actually the same. You do know what an analogy means, right?
I understand what analogy means.
So why are you pointing out that in some court cases, somebody might actually be convinced that the defendant actually did it, but they're forced to vote not guilty based on the rules of the courtroom? That is utterly irrelevant to the point that I was making.
The reason I said it is to demonstrate to you that for most people, to say that they believe something does not eliminate the possibility that there might be a reasonable doubt. So
No, it doesn't, Kyle. Here's the thing. I'm talking about whether or not somebody believes something, and you're talking about how they act based upon that belief. Yes, you are, because they...
No, I'm not.
Kyle, you just said that there are people who are convinced that the defendant is guilty, but they vote not guilty. What you're saying is that they are convinced that the individual is guilty. They believe it, but they're going to act in an opposite way. Those are two different things. You can believe some... You're wrong.
I disagree.
You're wrong.
I disagree. Okay, well then let me move on to my second statement.
No, call back.
I don't even really agree with this premise. I think if you're a juror and you're convinced a person's guilty, then you don't have a reasonable doubt. If it's based on the evidence that's presented in the case.
And if
it's based on a feeling you get when you meet them, that's I don't see how you could say you're convinced by that.
It could be any number of reasons, but there's a difference between I am convinced of this and this is the action I'm going to take on behalf of it. And he's tied up with this, well, people might be convinced that the defendant's actually guilty, but they'll vote not guilty. Yeah, those are two different things. I can be convinced that, that OJ did it and still let him off with a technicality. Or I could just say, you know what? Prosecutors go for jury nullification all the time. Yeah, we all know he did it, but let's let him go anyway. Somebody murders the individual who killed his daughter. And you get up there and everybody on the jury is convinced that this guy actually did it. And yet their action that they take may be to vote not guilty in order to let him off. That's why they're two different things. But I'm talking about the courtroom analogy is just about what people actually believe, which is separate. It's about following the evidence to a conclusion, or even crappy evidence or bad arguments to a conclusion.
Yeah.